former president of the United States of America, Donald John Trump, has been indicted by the United States of America on a series of felony charges, and he has pleaded not guilty in federal court. Wait. Who wrote this? We did this story already. I swear, last month, 6 weeks ago maybe, we did this. Can I get a producer in here and some quality control so we don't get out-of-date scripts again? Trump indicted. We did this story already. Bill Murray, Saturday Night Live, death of Pope John Paul I, 1978. Sorry, I had to. There's a point to this coming up. First, there are two headlines, actual headlines from this, one substantial, one symbolic, and the substantial one is really substantial. The timeline that the court imposed, and imposed is the exact word, they hit Trump over the effing head with it. You've heard that phrase from courts, docket. The judge demanded a brief from Jack Smith's office proposing a trial date and its estimate of how long the trial will take, and she wants it Thursday. And then Trump's lawyers have to file a response to that the Thursday after that, the 17th. And the presiding jurist, the Judge Roy Bean of the January 6th insurrection, Tanya Chutkin, will pick the trial date at 10 a.m. August 28th. That's 3 weeks from Monday. Rocket docket. This is the Saturn V of schedules, the Luna 13 of law, the Javelin rocket of jurisprudence. Seriously, there is no doubt whatsoever that Smith and maybe even Merrick Garland have realized they are working against the clock, and that democracy is working against the clock, and that it is imperative to put him on trial not just before the election, but well before the election. And it was intriguing to see one of the CNN analysts who has had pretty good sources on this, I worked with her at NBC, Jamie Gangel, quote her contacts as uniformly identifying the takeaway of indictment day as how pared down and concise this case against Trump is compared to the now 40 counts in Florida. And they all took the same guess as to why, to give the judge and any other judges Trump tries to drag in to mess up the timeline absolutely no excuse to not start this trial ASAP, maybe even before the first of the year. We can have no idea if Garland or Smith or Trump or anybody else saw the polling on this by Reuters Ipsos that came out yesterday, but it is intriguing if not conclusive. 45% of Republicans say they would not vote for Trump if he has been, quote, convicted of a felony crime by a jury. 45% of Republicans. I'll caveat that. One, they say that now. And two, they may be saying that now because the assumption on the right is that Trump can stall all these trials indefinitely. I really wonder if the number would look different if the polling was done after this Justice Express docket had been released. There was considerable reporting from inside the Prettyman Courthouse that Trump looked really honked off about something yesterday, especially compared to his demeanor at the Florida arraignment, and a really good guess would be this, the court dates, the SpaceX of sentencing. That was the substantial headline. The symbolic one, that photo of Trump at the airport for the return flight to Bedminster. New York Times, alone, getting out of just another SUV, looking down, carrying his own umbrella, with a stunned expression on his saggy face and looking like a sack of wet spit. And his near incoherence in his brief statement, unable to focus on himself for the first time in his life, and instead going off on worldwide television about how horrible the graffiti was in Washington. And knowing he had blown it, suddenly remembering he was supposed to say, "This is a persecution of a political opponent. This was never supposed to happen in America," unquote. By which, of course, he meant this was never supposed to happen to him in America, because he ran on persecuting his political opponent in 2016. He told Hillary Clinton to her face at a debate that he would put her in prison. And then as president, he tried to get the president of Ukraine to fabricate evidence with which to persecute Joe Biden. Something his goblins on Capitol Hill like Jamie Comer and Kevin McCarthy are still trying to do. And we're supposed to forget that? And for once, with cameras rolling, Trump could not pull off his only trick, being martyred Trump or fearless Trump or vengeful Trump or something Trump. He came off as damp, limp, chump Trump. And kudos to CNN and MSNBC, among other networks, for cutting away from the live feed from the tarmac as Dementia J started to talk. Somehow somebody learned something. BBC News, sadly, worldwide did not. They carried that nonsense live. On the other hand, CNN also had a reporter in a car chasing the Trump motorcade and who were duly rewarded with the audio or the video going out on every hit from the correspondent. And the rest of the time, they got a shot of the car right ahead of them that Trump also wasn't in. Notes from inside the Prettyman courthouse, and there are competing reports as to who stared daggers at whom, and in fact, whether daggers were even stared. While the New York Times insisted Trump never made eye contact with Jack Smith, CNN reported Smith stared at Trump, or at least won the staring contest. ABC reported that, quote, Trump could be seen staring right toward Smith, knocking his clasped hands on the table in a tense way. It's not really news. Of course it was a tense way. He's a psychopath. They get tense when the people who can destroy them are not scared away by their loud noises. Also, Trump pleaded not guilty in his own voice, was asked to confirm he understood he had the right to remain silent, claimed he understood that. He doesn't understand that. And probably the only unexpected development of the whole day came in the traditional barrage of self-pitying, self-martyring social media posts by Trump, in which he spelled the word stolen correctly. S-T-O, just one L-E-N. World financial markets crashed due to the resultant uncertainty among investors that there was anything on this earth they could still rely on. Two associated headlines. He may be only unindicted co-conspirator number 2, but he's still unindicted sucker number 1. John Eastman still doesn't get it. As my old friend Steve Bogart's dad said to Mary Astor, "You're taking the fall." Eastman's lawyer repeats he's not flipping and he's not guilty of anything. And they are sending prosecutors a memo, oh good, another Eastman memo, arguing that Eastman was acting, quote, as an attorney advising a client that the advice was lawful and that Eastman should not be indicted. Somebody needs to wake them up and remind them. Trump's argument is that he was listening to that advice and that he's not guilty because Eastman is. The other note, if you were again disappointed by the lack of a mugshot of the defendant, good news, everyone. Fulton County Sheriff Patrick Labatt has told the New York Times that if Trump is indicted in Georgia, he would get treatment identical to any other suspect being booked. Quote, unless someone tells me differently, the sheriff said, he plans to follow normal practices. We'll have mugshots ready for you. Can I get one in a size 38 by 744 feet? Big picture. A year ago, first episode of this series, I suggested that the House January 6th committee obviously served a real-time purpose, but that ultimately it didn't matter, even if it had really only been created exclusively for an audience of one, Merrick Garland. Sure enough, huge traffic yesterday on air and online about the Liz Cheney committee, which is how it will be remembered, even though she was not the chair, Benny Thompson was. All of it was deserved praise for the efforts and the straight line that history will draw between what it did and yesterday's indictments. And some of it went almost shockingly further than that. Congressman Brendan Boyle of Philadelphia, who has been in the House exactly 214 days, let her rip. Quote, thank you, Speaker Pelosi, for creating the House January 6th committee. If it were just up to the weak and feckless Merrick Garland and Lisa Monaco, then today would have never happened. It's only shocking because it's true. And that brings up another point. If you're not old enough to appreciate this, I apologize. But from the day John Glenn went up in Friendship 7 when I was 3, until the night when I was 10 when Neil Armstrong got moon dust all over that nice clean spacesuit of his, there was a building crescendo of excitement over the years as we got closer and closer to the moon launch and the landing, and then I just had to go look up online who was on the mission between Armstrong and Aldrin and Collins on Apollo 11 that landed on the moon and got out, and Lovell, Hayes, and Swigert driving home the junk bus that was 13. I had no memory of Apollo 12. And that deflation of the excitement was, by all accounts, universal in this country. And thus it is, sadly, with Trump indictments. The silliness of the opening of this episode notwithstanding, there was a point to it. As valuable, essential as yesterday was to our declining chances of preserving representative government in this country, there was an astounding sense of anticlimax. We've seen this before. This time, there weren't even any interesting-looking Trump lunatics outside. And him? As I said before, wow, way to under-deliver, Donnie. Got a roll of stamps and mail it in. That's because, obviously, it is time to get off the pot and put him in the can. I could not be happier that the judges in Washington have decided to kick his ass with this high-speed calendar. But the secret value to the high-speed calendar is it gives us frequent changes to the narrative and the excitement levels to carry us through to the next hearing, and we need that as a nation to fight back against Trump. Till the next hearing. Or maybe the next indictment, Fonnie. Maybe the next indictment, Jack. Because as repetitive as some of these are, as spectacle, we want him so indicted that he can't pass gas without violating a court order. We want him so indicted. Wait, so indicted? So indicted. I feel a song coming on. Oh, Nancy! I'm so indicted and I just can't fight it. I'm about to go to jail and America likes it. I'm so indicted. My defense ain't airtighted. And I know the unindicted co-conspirators can bite it. Bite it. Thank you, Nancy Faust. We need to put out an album. Not of music. I would like to point out that in a 1-2 week span, I anchored a presidential inauguration and the Super Bowl. There are related non-Trump headlines to duck in here, and first on our quick trip to Shelbyville and the other America, and the lead story last night at the pretty good barometer that is the Washington Examiner, not the Trump indictment, not even the Devon Archer transcript, which they seem to have dismissed as the dud it was. No, this, quote, Youngkin would beat Biden in Virginia, new poll finds. Youngkin would beat Biden in Virginia, new poll finds. If that name does not ring a bell, Youngkin is the governor of Virginia, who may yet step into the GOP race once they send in Ron DeSantis' mommy to go get him and bring him home, which could be, today-ish. Quote came out Wednesday, I guess, but it only started to steamroll yesterday. DeSantis cannot help himself and cannot stop himself and cannot save himself. On a tour of New Hampshire, he issued the now standard, "We're going to ensure the woke agenda ends up in the dustbin of history." But then he added something new, and apparently this is why they have him keep going back to woke. Woke this, woke that. Because when he tries something else, this happens. As to federal bureaucracy and federal bureaucrats, DeSantis said, quote, "We're going to start slitting throats on day one." You realize how bad that is? Even for fascists who relish a good execution metaphor, that's just way too gory. That's how bad it is. And be careful, Rhonda. The throat you slit may just have been your own. And lastly, Dr. Cornel West, pissing away a career of service to this nation by running on the Let's Elect Trump Anyway platform, turns out to be just a little bit behind on the old taxes. Just $543,000. The Daily Beast could get no comment out of West or his current campaign manager, Jill Stein. No, I'm not kidding. Also of interest here, unless you saw this tweet, you will never in a million years correctly guess which conservative tweeted one of the most horrifying Freudian slips of all time. Quote, I highly encourage you to attend our child trafficking training in Sarasota. Ugh, God. That's next. This is Countdown.
This is Countdown with Keith Olbermann, my crazy friend.
This is SportsCenter. Wait, check that. Not anymore. This is Countdown with Keith Olbermann.
In sports, man, are sports people owning themselves lately in droves. In one case, it's folks from the usual shut up and dribble crowd, basketball's Orlando Magic, owned by members of the infamous DeVos family, taking huge heat from many quarters because the franchise donated $50,000. The check says Orlando Magic on it. The donation was to an arm of the Ron DeSantis campaign, right after DeSantis' latest anti-LGBTQ actions and contemporaneous with DeSantis' imbecilic remarks about how slavery taught the slaves useful skills like blacksmithing. The Magic then tried to claim that the team was not donating to the campaign, but merely as a business to the state of Florida. Then ownership claimed the check was written before DeSantis had announced he was running, which is a distinction without a difference, but also doesn't line up with the date on the check. And now the Orlando Magic have been sandblasted by the National Basketball Players Association. Quote, NBA governors, players, and personnel have the right to express their personal political views, including through donations and statements, the union writes in a press release. However, if contributions are made on behalf of an entire team, using money earned through the labor of its employees, it is incumbent upon the team governors to consider the diverse values and perspectives of staff and players. The Magic's donation does not represent player support for the recipient, unquote. A very salient point. What the NBAPA should do now, of course, is donate some equal or larger amount to the Biden campaign or one of the groups fighting DeSantis' tyranny in Florida, or, I don't know, buy $50,000 worth of banned books and hand them out to kids, or anybody really, and do it on behalf of the Orlando Magic, the players. And meanwhile, in golf, with the PGA Tour selling out the sport in this country so the Saudis can take it over completely and sports wash its blood money at events like the U.S. Open and the Masters. That would be the Prince Mohammed bin Salman Masters. Guess who has been added to the PGA Tour Policy Board? Tiger Woods. For Tiger Woods, this is either a chance to redeem his increasingly sketchy reputation or him making a complete sellout of himself. We will see. Tiger Woods was one of the leading opponents of the Saudi Trump Live Golf Tour, which bought the PGA in June and which has ever since pretended that this is a partnership or a merger. With Woods on the PGA board, actual players, actual golfers now outnumber the non-playing directors 6-5, with the 12th member being the PGA's president. What it sounds like is Tiger Woods to the rescue, stopping this farce which was engineered in large part by the PGA commissioner, Jay Monahan. However, the first statement by Tiger Woods, in fact, his first statement since the Saudis bought the PGA, Tiger praised Commissioner Jay Monahan, quote, "We look forward to being at the table with him to make the right decisions for the future of the game. He has my confidence moving forward with these changes." Uh-oh. Still ahead on Countdown Fridays with Thurber and with the latest arraignment of Donald Trump. Collect the whole series. There can be no better story to read you than Thurber's Nostradamus-like writing of a story that's basically about Trump 15 years before Trump was born. The greatest man in the world, coming up. First, it's time for the daily roundup of the miscreants, morons, and Dunning-Kruger effect specimens who constitute today's worst persons in the world. The bronze, falsetto-voiced Fox quote news unquote screeching whiner Mark Levin, one of the worst of the whores who will say or claim anything to defend Trump, an unbelievably damaging figure even in the right-wing media bottomless pit of pus. Levin's ire now is directed at Bill Barr. He's trying to claim the former Attorney General, quote, cooperated with Jack Smith's office, whatever that means. Levin then wrote Barr is, quote, all over TV like erectile dysfunction commercials. And on a day when Trump finally spelled stolen correctly, Levin misspelled dysfunction. The disease, erectile dysfunction, that has a Y. He spelled it with an I, which tells you everything you need to know about Mark Levin. The runners-up, the residents of Tampa, Florida. Hello! Not all of them, mind you, but there is an epidemic there of what might be the worst thing you could have an epidemic of, other than, like, the rats we have here in the New York City area. The worst thing, though, besides rats that you could have an epidemic of from a civic pride and tourism standpoint, dumpster fires. In the last year, Tampa has had more than 1,200 dumpster fires. Not metaphorical dumpster fires, not symbolic dumpster fires, not political dumpster fires, not sports dumpster fires. Tampa dumpsters catching fire. What's worse, this year there have been 3 so-called hot load dumpster fires in which the dumpsters catch fire spontaneously because people have just thrown away with the regular trash, things like lithium-ion batteries and tanks of propane and electronics, and they just blowed up. They blowed up good. They blowed up real good. So welcome to Tampa, city of dumpster fires. But our winner, and yes, there is a segue here, General Michael Flynn. And if you already thought he was nuts, you ain't seen nothing yet. As you know, Flynn went full QAnon and Pizzagate, and he sees invisible devils. He did this a long time ago, so what he was trying to tweet was understandable in the context of his various manias, but the wording was, seriously, generally, you need to see a psychotherapist as quickly as possible. Freudian slips. I'm quoting him here on a retweet of a link to one of these Holy Rollers conventions in Florida on August 17th. You ready? General Michael Flynn, in public, quote, I highly encourage you to attend our child trafficking training in Sarasota, unquote. I'll just read that quote again. I highly encourage you, Flynn wrote, to attend our child trafficking training in Sarasota. Oh, boy. Mike, child trafficking training Flynn, today's worst person in the world! Sit back and relax, if relax is the right word for it, for The Greatest Man in the World by James Thurber. Looking back on it now from the vantage point of 1940, one can only marvel that it had not happened long before it did. The United States of America had been, ever since Kitty Hawk, blindly constructing the elaborate petard by which sooner or later it must be hoist. It was inevitable that someday there would come roaring out of the skies a national hero of insufficient intelligence, background, and character successfully to endure the mounting orgies of glory prepared for aviators who stayed up for a long time or flew a great distance. Both Lindbergh and Byrd, fortunately for national decorum and international amity, had been gentlemen. So had our other famous aviators. They wore their laurels gracefully, withstood the awful weather of publicity, married excellent women, usually of fine family, and quietly retired to private life and the enjoyment of their varying fortunes. No untoward incidents on a worldwide scale marred the perfection of their conduct on the perilous heights of fame. The exception to the rule was, however, bound to occur, and it did. In July 1937, when Jack Pal Smirch, erstwhile mechanic's helper, in a small garage in Westfield, Iowa, flew a second-hand, single-motored, Breasthaven Dragonfly 3 monoplane all the way around the world without stopping. Never before in the history of aviation had such a flight as Smirch's even been dreamed of. No one had even taken seriously the weird floating auxiliary gas tanks, invention of the mad New Hampshire professor of astronomy, Dr. Charles Lewis Gresham, upon which Smirch placed full reliance. When the garage worker, a slightly built, surly, unprepossessing young man of 22, appeared at Roosevelt Field early in July 1937, slowly chewing a great quid of scrap tobacco, and announced, "Nobody ain't seen no flying yet," the newspapers touched briefly and satirically upon his projected 25,000-mile flight. Aeronautical and automotive experts dismissed the idea curtly, implying that it was a hoax, a publicity stunt. The rusty, battered, second-hand plane wouldn't go. The Gresham auxiliary tanks wouldn't work. It was simply a cheap joke. Smirch, however, after calling on a girl in Brooklyn who worked in the flap-folding department of a large paper box factory, a girl whom he later described as his sweet patootie, climbed nonchalantly into his ridiculous plane at dawn of the memorable 7th of July, 1937, spit a curve of tobacco juice into the still air, and took off, carrying with him only a gallon of bootleg gin and 6 pounds of salami. When the garage boy thundered out over the ocean, the papers were forced to record in all seriousness that a mad, unknown young man, his name was variously misspelled, had actually set out upon a preposterous attempt to span the world in a rickety one-engine contraption, trusting to the long-distance refueling device of a crazy schoolmaster. When 9 days later, without having stopped once, the tiny plane appeared above San Francisco Bay, headed for New York, spluttering and choking to be sure, but still magnificently and miraculously aloft, the headlines, which long since had crowded everything else off the front page, even the shooting of the governor of Illinois by the Valetti gang, swelled to unprecedented size, and the news stories began to run to 25 and 30 columns. It was noticeable, however, that the accounts of the epoch-making flight touched rather lightly upon the aviator himself. This was not because the facts about the hero as a man were too meager, but because they were too complete. Reporters who had been rushed out to Iowa when Smirch's plane was first sighted over the little French coast town of Cergy-le-Maire to dig up the story of the great man's life had promptly discovered that the story of his life could not be printed. His mother, a sullen short-order cook in a shack restaurant on the edge of a tourist's camping ground near Westfield, met all inquiries as to her son with an angry, "Ah, the hell with him. I hope he drowns." His father appeared to be in jail somewhere for stealing spotlights and lap robes from tourists' automobiles. His young brother, a weak-minded lad, had but recently escaped from the Preston, Iowa reformatory and was already wanted in several western towns for the theft of money order blanks from post offices. These alarming discoveries were still piling up at the very time that Pal Smirch, the greatest hero of the 20th century, blear-eyed, dead for sleep, half-starved, was piloting his crazy junk heap high above the region in which the lamentable story of his private life was being unearthed, headed for New York and a greater glory than any man of his time had ever known. The necessity for printing some account in the papers of the young man's career and personality had led to a remarkable predicament. It was, of course, impossible to reveal the facts, for a tremendous popular feeling in favor of the young hero had sprung up like a grass fire when he was halfway across Europe on his flight around the globe. He was, therefore, described as a modest chap, taciturn, blonde, popular with his friends, popular with girls. The only available snapshot of Smirch, taken at the wheel of a phony automobile in a cheap photo studio at an amusement park, was touched up so that the little vulgarian looked quite handsome. His twisted leer was smoothed into a pleasant smile. The truth was, in this way, kept from the youth's ecstatic compatriots. They did not dream that the Smirch family was despised and feared by its neighbors in the obscure Iowa town, nor that the hero himself, because of numerous unsavory exploits, had come to be regarded in Westfield as a nuisance and a menace. Pal Smirch had, the reporters discovered, once knifed the principal of his high school. Not mortally, to be sure, but he had knifed him. And on another occasion, surprised in the act of stealing an altar cloth from a church, he had bashed the sexton over the head with a pot of Easter lilies. For each of these offenses, he had served a sentence in the reformatory. Inwardly, the authorities, both in New York and in Washington, prayed that an understanding Providence might, however awful such a thing seemed, bring disaster to the rusty, battered plane and its illustrious pilot, whose unheard-of flight had aroused the civilized world to hosannas of hysterical praise. The authorities were convinced that the character of the renowned aviator was such that the limelight of adulation was bound to reveal him to all the world as a congenital hooligan, mentally and morally unequipped to cope with his own prodigious fame. "I trust," said the Secretary of State at one of the many secret cabinet meetings called to consider the national dilemma, "I trust that his mother's prayer will be answered," by which he referred to Mrs. Emma Smirch's wish that her son might be drowned. It was, however, too late for that. Smirch had leaped the Atlantic and then the Pacific as if they were mill ponds. At 3 minutes after 2 o'clock on the afternoon of July 17th, 1937, the garage boy brought his idiotic plane into Roosevelt Field for a perfect three-point landing. It had, of course, been out of the question to arrange a modest little reception for the greatest flyer in the history of the world. He was received at Roosevelt Field with such elaborate and pretentious ceremonies as rocked the world. Fortunately, however, the worn and spent hero promptly swooned, had to be removed bodily from his plane, and was spirited from the field without having opened his mouth once. Thus, he did not jeopardize the dignity of his first reception, a reception illumined by the presence of the Secretaries of War and the Navy, Mayor Michael J. Moriarty of New York, the Premier of Canada, Governors Fanaman, Groves, McFeely, and Critchfield, and a brilliant array of European diplomats. Smirch did not, in fact, come to in time to take part in the gigantic hullabaloo arranged at City Hall for the next day. He was rushed to a secluded nursing home and confined in bed. It was 9 days before he was able to get up, or to be more exact, before he was permitted to get up. Meanwhile, the greatest minds in the country in solemn assembly had arranged a secret conference of city, state, and government officials, which Smirch was to attend for the purpose of being instructed in the ethics and behavior of heroism. On the day that the little mechanic was finally allowed to get up and dress, and for the first time in 2 weeks took a great chew of tobacco, he was permitted to receive the newspaper men, this by way of testing him out. Smirch did not wait for questions. "Yous guys," he said, and the Times man winced. "Yous guys can tell the cockeyed world that I put it over on Lindbergh, see? Yeah, made an ass of them two frogs." The two frogs was a reference to a pair of gallant French flyers who, in attempting a flight only halfway around the world, had 2 weeks before unhappily been lost at sea. The Times man was bold enough at this point to sketch out for Smirch the accepted formula for interviews in cases of this kind. He explained that there should be no arrogant statements belittling the achievements of other heroes, particularly heroes of foreign nations. "To hell with that," said Smirch. "I did it, see? I did it, and I'm talking about it." And he did talk about it. None of this extraordinary interview was, of course, printed. On the contrary, the newspapers, already under the disciplined direction of a secret directorate created for the occasion and composed of statesmen and editors, gave out to a panting and restless world that Jackie, as he had been arbitrarily nicknamed, would consent to say only that he was very happy and that anyone could have done what he did. "My achievement has been, I fear, slightly exaggerated," the Times man's article had him protest with a modest smile. These newspaper stories were kept from the hero, a restriction which did not serve to abate the rising malevolence of his temper. The situation was indeed extremely grave, for Pal Smirch was, as he kept insisting, raring to go. He could not much longer be kept from a nation clamorous to lionize him. It was the most desperate crisis the United States of America had faced since the sinking of the Lusitania. On the afternoon of the 27th of July, Smirch was spirited away to a conference room in which were gathered mayors, governors, government officials, behaviorist psychologists, and editors. He gave them each a limp, moist paw and a brief, unlovely grin. "Hiya," he said. When Smirch was seated, the mayor of New York arose and, with obvious pessimism, attempted to explain what he must say and how he must act when presented to the world, ending his talk with a high tribute to the hero's courage and integrity. The mayor was followed by Governor Fetterman of New York, who, after a touching declaration of faith, introduced Cameron Spottiswoode, second secretary of the American Embassy in Paris, the gentleman selected to coach Smirch in the amenities of public ceremonies. Sitting in a chair with a soiled yellow tie in his hand and his shirt open at the throat, unshaved, smoking a rolled cigarette, Jack Smirch listened with a leer on his lips. I get you, he cut in nastily. "You want me to act like a softy, huh? You want me to act like that mebbity baby face Lindbergh, huh? Well, nuts to that, see?" Everyone took in his breath sharply. It was a sigh and a hiss. "Mr. Lindbergh," began a United States senator, purple with rage, "and Mr. Byrd," Smirch, who was paring his nails with a jackknife, cut in again. "Boyd!" he exclaimed. For God's sake, that big—" Somebody shut off the blasphemies with a sharp word. A newcomer had entered the room. Everyone stood up except Smirch, who was still busy with his nails, and he did not even glance up. "Mr. Smirch," said someone sternly, "the President of the United States." It had been thought that the presence of the chief executive might have a chastening effect on the young hero, and the former had been, thanks to the remarkable cooperation of the press, secretly brought to the obscure conference room. A great, painful silence fell. Smirch looked up, waved a hand at the president. "How you coming?" he asked, and began rolling a fresh cigarette. The silence deepened. Someone coughed in a strained way. "Geez, it's hot, ain't it?" said Smirch. He loosened two more shirt buttons, revealing a hairy chest and the tattooed word Sadie enclosed in a stenciled heart. The great and important men in the room, faced by the most serious crisis in American history, exchanged worried frowns. Nobody seemed to know how to proceed. Come on, said Smirch. Let's get the hell out of here. When do I start cutting in on the parties, huh? And when is there gonna be this in it? He rubbed a thumb and forefinger together meaningly. Money? Exclaimed a state senator, shocked, pale. Yeah, money, said Powell, flipping his cigarette out of the window. And big money. He began rolling a fresh cigarette. Big money, he repeated, frowning over the rice paper. He tilted back in his chair and leered at each gentleman separately. The leer of an animal that knows its power. The leer of a leopard loose in a bird and dog shop. For God's sake, let's get someplace where it's cooler, he said. I've been cooped up plenty for 3 weeks. Smirch stood up and walked over to an open window, where he stood staring down into the street 9 floors below. The faint shouting of newsboys floated up to him. He made out his name. Hot dog, he cried, grinning, ecstatic. He leaned out over the sill. You tell 'em, babies, he shouted down. Hot diggity dog! In the tense little knot of men standing behind him, a quick, mad impulse flared up. An unspoken word of appeal, of command, seemed to ring through the room, yet it was deadly silent. Charles K. L. Brand, secretary to the mayor of New York City, happened to be standing nearest Smirch. He looked inquiringly at the President of the United States. The President, pale, grim, nodded shortly. Brand, a tall, powerfully built man, once a tackle at Rutgers University, stepped forward, seized the greatest man in the world by his left shoulder and the seat of his pants, and pushed him out the window. My God, he's fallen out the window, cried a quick-witted editor. Get me out of here, cried the president. Several men sprang to his side, and he was hurriedly escorted out of a door toward a side entrance of the building. The editor of the Associated Press took charge, being used to such things. Crisply, he ordered certain men to leave, others to stay. Quickly, he outlined a story which all the papers were to agree on, sent 2 men to the street to handle that end of the tragedy, commanded a senator to sob, and 2 congressmen to go to pieces nervously. In a word, he skillfully set the stage for the gigantic task that was to follow, the task of breaking to a grief-stricken world the sad story of the untimely, accidental death of its most illustrious and spectacular figure. The funeral was, as you know, the most elaborate, the finest, the solemnest, and the saddest ever held in the United States of America. The monument in Arlington Cemetery, with its clean white shaft of marble and the simple device of a tiny plane carved on its base, is a place for pilgrims in deep reverence to visit. The nations of the world paid lofty tributes to little Jackie Smirch, America's greatest hero. At a given hour, there were 2 minutes of silence throughout the nation. Even the inhabitants of the small, bewildered town of Westfield, Iowa, observed this touching ceremony. Agents of the Department of Justice saw to that. One of them was especially assigned to stand grimly in the doorway of a little shack restaurant on the edge of the tourists' camping ground just outside the town. There, under his stern scrutiny, Mrs. Emma Smirch bowed her head over 2 hamburger steaks sizzling on her grill, bowed her head and turned away so that the Secret Service man could not see the twisted, strangely familiar leer on her lips. The Greatest Man in the World by James Thurber. I've done all the damage I can do here. Thank you for listening. Here are the credits. Most of the music arranged, produced, and performed by Brian Ray and John Philip Chanel, who are the Countdown musical directors. All orchestration and keyboards by John Philip Chanel. Guitars, bass, and drums by Brian Ray. Produced by TKO Brothers. Other Beethoven selections have been arranged and performed by the group No Horns Allowed. The sports music is the Olbermann theme from ESPN2, and it was written by Mitch Warren Davis, courtesy of ESPN Inc. Musical comments by Nancy Faust, the best baseball stadium organist ever, who accompanied me in my song today. Our announcer today was my friend Tony Kornheiser, and everything else was pretty much my fault. So that's countdown for this, the 940th day since Donald Trump's first attempted coup against the democratically elected government of the United States. Arrest him again while we still can. God knows there's more where that came from. The next scheduled countdown is Monday. Bulletins as the news warrants. Till then, I'm Keith Olbermann. Good morning, good afternoon, good night, and good luck. I'm so indicted, and I just can't fight it. I'm about to go to jail, and America likes it. I'm so indicted, my defense ain't airtighted. And I know the unindicted co-conspirators can bite it.